I haven't noticed that many confused people in the room, so I understand you all understand that this hui tonight is to really give some background, historical and relational to the Anglican Church's apology to local hapu. Those of you that have wandered into the room by mistake, you're welcome to stay. In fact, I'd encourage you to stay. And we're looking forward to a really strong evening in terms of dialogue and discussion, and that's the purpose of this hui. So the first speaker tonight is Dr. Alistair Reese. Alistair's a local now, I think, aren't you, Alistair? Just about. He lives at Pangaroa, and he's done a lot of study over the last few years, theology, history, tikanga Māori. He's got a PhD from the University of Auckland, and he's got a focus on reconciliation and has done some very authoritative work about Tauranga Moana in particular. And I'd just like you to welcome Alistair to the podium.
E nore ki te atua, mā ngā rongo ki te whenua, a whakara pai ka ngā tangata katoa, Tauranga Moana, ngā tamarawaho, ngā te tapu, ngā mātāwaka kei Wanganui a tātou e tēnei pō. Ka huri atu ki ngā tangata tiriti me ngā hau e whā, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I want to, before I begin, just to acknowledge three people who moved me in the direction of this research. I need to acknowledge that I stand on their shoulders. The research is not original, it's just my package of it. I want first to acknowledge an old late friend called Monty Ohia, another instrumental historian who influenced me was a Pirirako historian, Peter Rollston, and a local kuia who lives now in Tūranga Waiwai is Ngahuia Dixon, who challenged me many years ago when I was doing my study at Waikato University, and she pointed the finger at me and she said, "You need to do some research on what your people did to my people in Tauranga Moana." So I didn't have any idea what my people did to her people in Tauranga Moana many years ago, and so that started me on a bit of a journey to try to understand something about this place in which I live. So tonight I'm going to give a very, for a historian it's a bit difficult, but a very truncated version of something about this Te Papa block that we're talking about, and which is in some sense the core aspect or the pūtaki really of the apology that is coming up on the 1st of December. And I'll give a little bit I will talk more about the kind of the micro processes involved in the of the Church Missionary Society with the two hapu here. And then Sir David Moxon will move further into the area of the Anglican apology. So mine is sort of a bit of an historical narrative. For those of you that don't know, and many of you will know much of this, one of the difficulties of this talk is not knowing the audience and knowing, how much people know or how little. So please excuse me if I'm either it's too simple or it's too complex. I'm just trying to find a middle way on this. The piece of land that is referred to as Te Papa is the piece of land that now really, because of modern technology and the shifting harbours, starts at the Strand and moves back towards what we would now call Gate Pa or Pukehinahina. That's the area of coloured land on that screen. I guess my argument is saying Te Papa is Naboth's vineyard, and some of you will ask the question, what the heck does a vineyard got to do with Tauranga? Just a brief explanation. The term Naboth's Vineyard comes from a biblical passage in the Old Testament, and it refers to a time when one of the kings of Israel had a lust for a piece of land that was owned by a man called Naboth, and between him and his wife, they actually managed to take the land from the vineyard owner, Naboth, and they, in the end, they actually killed him and took over the land. So that's what was referred to in the Old Testament as Naboth's Vineyard. And interestingly enough, the motif of Naboth's Vineyard was actually a very well-used motif right up and down the motu by Māori when they were referring to their land. They referred to it often as Naboth's Vineyard. So this area here became referred to as Naboth's Vineyard by several folk, and you will see that when I move through the presentation. But it's important at least you have some understanding, where does this Naboth's Vineyard come from? So it's the seizing of a piece of land by the powerful of the less powerful. I'm talking about a group of people that go under the name of Church Missionary Society. They were predominantly an Anglican mission society that first came here in 1814 into New Zealand, but they were led by a man called Henry Williams, or he was called Te Wiremu or Karuwha because he wore glasses. And Karuwha sailed down into this region many times from the mid-1820s onward. He came down to collect supplies, kumara and potatoes, etc., from Tauranga Moana and take them back to the mission station in Paihia. One of the other things that Te Wiremu did was he sailed with Ngāpuhi on some of their illustrious, we might say, voyages down here when they were equipped with muskets. And this is one of my favourite engravings of all time, is Te Wiremu in his schooner, in his boat, the Active, sailing alongside Ngāpuhi Wakataua. And he sailed in and amongst them all the way down here, and he spent time in the harbour when Ngāpuhi were in this harbour, and he got to know some of the rangatira here during that time of what we would call actually a peacemaking journey. During that time, the rangatira from this region began to ask Wiremu to come to set up their mission stations in this area. At the time he turned them down. He said the timing was not right because of all the conflagrations that were happening around the time of the Musket Wars. But he continued these journeys down and proceeded to grow the relationship between Tangata Whenua and the Church Missionary Society. He and the Society received several invitations from Te Waharoa over in Ngāti Haua, Te Arawa, via Tapsel, the trader from Makatu, was instructed by Arawa chiefs to write to CMS to invite them into the district. And also, as I said, various chiefs from this area also invited the CMS to come and establish a mission in this region. So eventually that actually happened, and probably one of the most important people in our story is the family of Alfred and Charlotte Brown. And Alfred and Charlotte established what we now know as the Elms, or that mission station here. They built upon the work of some previous missionaries, William Wade and Philip King, who had established some ropo huts here, and they came and went because of the fact of the fighting, but in the end, CMS decided to establish a permanent mission station here in Tauranga Moana. One of Alfred Brown's most important allies in this was Wiremu Tamihana Tatara Pipipi from Ngāti Haua, and he became a chief supporter as did other locals like Matutahu, the tohunga that was involved in the Otamataha battle with Ngāti Maru. So he built up a very strong relationship with many of the local people here. So after being here for a little while, Alfred Brown entered into negotiations with the local hapu, and he negotiated to purchase from them two big pieces of land. The first one was around 30 acres of land, 300 acres of land, and the next one was around about 1,000 acres of land. You may ask the question, why would a Christian mission organisation purchase what in the end turned out to be around 1,333 acres of land? And you need to read some of the journals of Alfred Brown to understand that. So I've outlined a couple of the reasons here. He writes in his journey, I want to show to tangata whenua that by this act that we have no present intention of leaving them. So his commitment to buying the land was not for personal enhancement or for personal gain. In the first instance, he wanted to demonstrate to tangata whenua that that CMS was serious about their relationship with the people here, that they weren't fly-by-nighters, but they were here to stay, and the purchase of the land or the establishment of the land was a demonstration of that. The other pressing thing that Brown and other missionaries were concerned with was what he calls this tide of immigration that is happening. So in modern parlance, we'd call it land banking. The missionaries were extremely concerned about the amount of immigrants that were coming into New Zealand, immigrants that by their definition were lawless and land hungry and just really seeking to establish places for their own gain without actual consideration of local Māori. So Brown's concern at buying this land, in my view, was based upon humanitarian considerations. To reinforce this, I want to fast forward to a declaration by the parent organisation called the Church Missionary Society in the UK, and I'll refer to this again, but it's important, I think, to establish at least the base premise of why CMS purchased or received from tangata whenua this amount of land. So CMS and the parent committee said this: it is acquired and is retained under a solemn trust that it should be applied to the benefit of the native race and the church, that it should never be bartered or sold for the mere purpose of raising money. The natives who gave the land for the benefit of themselves and their posterity would have just ground of complaint against us if we sold that land, if we sold that land for a military settlement. So this is a very clear enunciation by the CMS UK that they were holding this land of Te Papa, albeit I imagine from some kind of paternalistic perspectives, they were holding it for the sake of Māori, and that was part of the negotiations that obviously had taken place between tangata whenua and the CMS, that this land transaction was actually a relational transaction and not what in Western terms and basically an economic transaction. I think it's important to note that the whole process was one that was essentially based around relationship and relationships of trust, and not for pecuniary gain, and not primarily only for the advancement of the CMS mission itself. Very quickly after that land had exchanged hands or had been transferred, sometimes it's difficult actually in English to use the terms, because in Māori there are other terms for this transference, and we're using a Pākehā language that actually doesn't do justice sometimes to the Māori terms. But very quickly, some locals were opposed to the occupation of this Te Papa block by CMS, and it caused a lot of concern to Brown. He couldn't understand why some people were opposed to this transaction. There was issues around payment and who got paid and who had the right to make these kinds of decisions. But I think I need to reinforce that there was no personal gain for Brown in this area. He says this: "I'm between the devil and the deep blue sea." He said, "In time, government would require more land to steer clear of giving offence to the powers that be," that's the government, "and at the same time, to sustain our character as guardians of the natives will require much of the wisdom that comes from above." He goes on to write, "The tide of immigration is setting upon us with a springtide of violence, and it will be well if the poor natives are not borne away in its restless course. Much, however, of the threatened evil may yet, under God's blessing, be averted if the powers vested by the British government in Captain Hobson, whose arrival in the Bay of Islands is, I understand, daily expected, are full and comprehensive." So he's talking now about the intervention of the British with Hobson, and even though he was reluctant to be involved in the political affairs, he found himself caught in the midst of that, and he was instructed by his bishops to be involved in the making available one of the versions of the treaty. So he ended up supporting the treaty. The treaty was signed here in Tauranga between the dates I've got there, the 10th of April and the 23rd of May in 1840, and there were 21 signatories. One of the provisions of the treaty, as you will know, is that there was a commission of inquiry to be set up. And the commission of inquiry was to examine any of the sale transactions that had happened prior to 1840. And so the CMS deal with Ngāi Tamarawaho and Ngāti Tapu was put to the test by an inquiry by Edward Godfrey. And eventually they were awarded this title, and it actually came out at 300 more acres than were originally thought. That inquiry had some witnesses, some opposition from local Māori who presented to the court or to the commission their opposition to the process. But their opposition to it was thrown out by the commission, and eventually the commission passed the awarding of the title to the Church Missionary Society. Two later historians, Professor Alan Ward and Vincent O'Malley, have said that the commission was at best perfunctory and at worst papered over obvious inconsistencies in the evidence presented. Rushing through time, land te pūtake o te reri. It's the guts of the anger, really, this whole question of land. And as we know that the thirst for land was unquenchable from our ancestors from Europe, and so we had the outbreak of war, firstly in Taranaki, the rise of kingitanga in the Waikato, and then of course the arrival of the troops here in Tauranga Moana. And the troops, much to the chagrin of Brown and the others, occupied much of the mission ground. Brown wrote, "The properties of the CMS at this place are under the direction and management of a land board appointed by the Society in England. As a member of that board, I desire to record my protest against locating the military settlers on the mission station until permission of the Society has been obtained. I believe that the proposed movement would be a heavy blow and discouragement to our missionary work in this district, and nor can I imagine that the CMS will consent to it until compelled to do so by the law." So he wrote to Gray and to others expressing his absolute abhorrence to the troops being here. But I think it needs to be said that at this time there was a shift in allegiance by many of the church missionary society missionaries. In the first instance, the missionaries stood with tangata whenua, particularly in Taranaki, with the outbreak of war with Waitangi. People like Octavius, Hatfield and Brown were opposed to the Crown's intervention in those places. But what happened was, with the rise of kingitanga, as I understand it, is that they found that a stretch too far to understand. They couldn't really grapple or come to terms with the fact that there was a queen and there was a king. And so Brown particularly had a lot of conference or discussions with Wiremu Tamihana about that, and began to voice his opposition to kingitanga. And eventually, even with the invasion of the Waikato by General Cameron, eventually Brown came onto the side of the Crown and said that this actually was a punishment from God, because Māori were in fact rebelling. As they rebelled against the Queen, they were rebelling against. As they were rebelling against the Queen, as they were supporting the King, they were rebelling against the Queen and rebelling against God. So that's where he actually arrived on that place. It doesn't mean that he lost the love and commitment to local people here, but that was, in a sense, the political position that he ended up occupying. So we turn and we have the Battle of Pukehinahina, and we know that many of the soldiers that were encamped around the elms, and some of about the officers that went to and had communions with Brown the night before the battle, where they celebrated communion. And we know that memory is a cause of mamai in some of the uri of those people that were fighting at Pukehinahina. After the battles of Pukehinahina and the Battle of Turanga, it became clear that the Crown was absolutely convinced or dedicated to surveying and carving up the Tauranga land, and they began to put pressure upon the CMS to actually dispense with their lands here, because they wanted to survey it for the militia, and also to establish a town here because of the harbour and the fertility of the place, and the strategic line, an Okati line between here and Kawhia was part of the strategy of cutting off the supplies from the south and to the north. Brown wrote to Governor Gray and says, "The Waikato militia are, I find, expecting their allotments to be immediately laid out on what they call the confiscated land. I hope the ministry will record as a mistake. Let us not have a renewal of Taranaki scenes connected with surveying, and let us try to procure a cession of territory, rather than keep alive the indignant feelings of the natives by wresting it from them." So Brown was against this forced occupation and the forced surveying of this Te Papa area. However, even within the CMS Mission Society, there were internal tensions around what to do with the land, what they should do with the pressures from the government to yield up the land in some way. And I've sensed that there was division within the CMS board that consisted of a secretary in Auckland, the Reverend Burrows. It consisted of the Bishop of Waiapu, William Williams, Alfred Brown from here, and 2 or 3 others. It was led, I think, the movement to part with the land by the Reverend Burrows in Auckland. May I point that finger? Brown wrote to Burrows in 1864, and he says, "I shall not at present take up the trouble of supposing that the government will possess Te Papa to the exclusion of the mission station. Their bill is not yet law, and there may be more obstacles than they anticipate to their occupancy of Naboth's vineyard." It was very clear in his heart that something was happening here, or the potential of betrayal was about to happen here in Tauranga Moana. He nominated that this place had the feeling or the appearance of a Naboth's vineyard. This was echoed by William Williams of Waipu, and he wrote, "It is possible that Te Papa may cease to be a mission station. It is indeed probable because it happens to be Naboth's vineyard." Can I speak from the CMS parent committee? This was their response to the pressure that came from the Crown. Henry Venn, who was the head of the CMS in UK, wrote to William Williams and he said, "Our committee has resolved that while upholding the principle of retaining the land as a sacred trust for the native race, they will nevertheless, if the Bishop of Waipu and Archdeacon Brown think it expedient, yield in the instance of the pressure of the government." So there was an unwillingness again from CMS in UK because of the element of trust, but because they had put the care or the authority of the land under the land board, yielded to the local opinion. Again, I want to reiterate, because I think it's crucial in this whole discussion, the original trust document to say that the land was acquired and is retained under a solemn trust, that it should be applied to the benefit of the native race and church, and that it should never be bartered or sold for the mere purpose of raising money. The natives who gave the land for the benefit of themselves. We have therefore declined all offers. If the government need the land for public purposes, they may take it from us, but we shall then claim compensation. This position was not held in the end. Despite some misgivings from Brown and others, 4/5 of this Te Papa land was given to the Crown. It wasn't sold. It was gifted to the Crown. 1/5 of the land was kept by CMS, and that land was again meant to be held in trust for the benefit of tangata whenua and for native mission. I have pondered for many years over why would it be that the CMS would actually give the land away. It's hard to actually be absolutely sure about this, but my sense is this. I think perhaps that CMS, Brown and Williams particularly, felt that if they actually sold the bulk of the land, that indeed would be a betrayal. So they acquiesced and actually gave the land to the Crown. That's just my best guess on that, and it's not an authoritative answer. In response to CMS's offer of a gift, Whitaker, who was the secretary, the Northern Secretary of Land for the government at the time, wrote, "Their offer is a very liberal one, and we will indeed accept it with gratitude." I will finish with 2 more slides. Te Papa, Naboth's vineyard. I call it a place of betrayal. I believe, and we're just talking about the Church Missionary Society tonight, they are not the only players in this, and obviously there are other players, but if we're talking as an introduction as to why the bishops have and the church has chosen to apologise, this is really the foundation of it. CMS had options for land negotiated under trust. When the pressure came on, they could have returned to tangata whenua and say, "What would you like us to do with this?" They could have listened to those within the Godfrey Commission who opposed the sale in the first place, instead of dismissing them as troublemakers. They could have held to the original trust and maintain a relational commitment to the two hapu. They could have refused Crown overtures. Now, I'm not wanting to judge harshly in these things. Who would know what one would have done in their circumstance? But we could say, and we might say, in sympathy with them, that they were under great pressure. But in retrospect, would hope that they would have continued their prophetic task to speak out against injustice. And this, as I understand it, is the thing that leads to the Anglican apologists. I want to finish with this last slide, and because my heart, particularly as a historian and a theologian who dwells in this region, is what might reconciliation for the heart of the city look like. A heart that is more than bricks and mortars. I believe that there is an opportunity that will be possible because of the leadership of the church as they bring this apology and they move towards some restitution, that the Tauranga Council, who has been a beneficiary via the gifting of the Crown to various pieces of land to the council, that both the Tauranga Council and the Crown and the Church together, combined with the goodwill of the citizens of Tauranga Moana, could actually move together to bring some reconciliation into this region. I am reminded as I finish with I guess it's a whakatauki which says I reru atu, I reru whenua atu me hoki mai, me hoki whenua mai, aroha mai for that. Land that was taken should be replaced by land. Nō reira kua mutu anane, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou katoa.